It's time for this week's episode of Brandon Sports Talk, featuring in-depth interviews from those who are trending in the world of athletics. And now, here's the host of Brandon Sports Talk, Brandon Pate.
Welcome back to Brandon Sports Talk. In today's episode, I have the privilege to interview the two owners of the podcast Across the Pond. It's a sports podcast. How are y'all doing today?
We're doing awesome. Yeah, we're good.
James, can you talk about how you knew that you wanted to start a sports talk podcast?
So I didn't have a clue. I'd seen some friends set up a podcast. They did a pretty poor job of it. And I thought I could do better. And they lasted 5 episodes, and we're just about at our 40th episode. So it was really just stemmed from listening to other podcasts. I've listened to other podcasts for years. Bill Simmons is kind of my idol, if you like. And just, yeah, I think just off the back of some friends putting in a pretty poor showing, I thought I could do a lot better.
Can you talk about, James, how you knew that you wanted to come up with the name Across the Pond?
So I have a lot of family and a lot of friends in the States. Obviously, from my accent, I'm not from the States. So over here in Scotland, whenever it's someone's birthday or whatever, I would send over like an Instagram message or Facebook Messenger, and I'd say happy birthday from across the pond. So I've been saying it for years, and I just put it together with the podcast.
That's an amazing idea. Kate, what are some of the segments that you have on your podcast?
So we specialize in talking about football. James and I, he also has separate segments where he has different guest hosts where he talks NBA, MLB. But James and I are the football two hosts, and it's a lot of fun. We have a review show where we talk about the games that happened last week, and then we have a preview show where we do it called Guess the Win Margin, and kind of see who's closer every week and talk football and what to expect in that upcoming week's games.
Kate, how do y'all come up with some of y'all's topics?
That's all James. He is the driver here. So he's the driver of the show, and then I'm kind of just the writer. So I just come in with the answers, and he drives everything. So James, I think you're better to answer that one.
Yeah, so I mean, because we're following the NFL and we're in a changing world, in terms of the news topics, it really just seems to be it's topical at the time. If there's any kind of breaking news as we're kind of going along, and then it's the games themselves. We kind of break down each game. Katie, I have to give her a lot more credit. She breaks down the games so well, and she really kind of, her knowledge of the game and knowledge of teams and players is really, really good. And I think a lot of podcasts would struggle to get someone like Katie on their podcast because she's just so good.
What are some of the segments that you have, James, on it?
So the segments are overall. So when I first started out, I was kind of doing like an hour-long show, and I was doing WNBA, NBA, NFL. I was trying to do NHL, but I did that poorly. And it was just an hour-long show, and it was just me talking all the time. And you know, I do like the sound of my own voice, but just not that much. So about 4th episode in, I actually got my dad and Joe to do an episode with me. And I loved it. I loved being able to bounce off of someone. So it's then evolved. So I do individual shows with a guy called Ryan Doherty, and we do the NBA. To give you an exclusive announcement, we are going to be launching a new podcast called Across the Pond Major League, which will be hosted by Joe and he's going to do baseball for us on a totally new podcast. So we are kind of growing. So the segments are kind of being whittled down to individual sports.
That's amazing. Kate, who are some of the people that you've interviewed for the podcast?
We've had special guests. So we've had people from both sides of the pond. We've had people, we have a pretty active Facebook group. So we have a Across the Pond Sports Podcast Facebook group. And the very first guest was someone that's super active in that group come on and join us. From there, we had, I believe, James, it was the under-18 basketball coach for Scotland, right?
Yeah, for Great Britain. Craig Nichol is under-18 head coach at basketball. And I've known him for years, but I know he loves football. And one thing he always moans about is he gets asked to go on podcasts and all they want to do is talk basketball, whereas his kind of passion away from basketball is football. So it was an easy sell to get him on.
We also have a former NFL player coming up in I think it's next week. We have a former NFL player, and then the former Broncos sideline reporter is going to be joining us too in future episodes. So we're lining up some more bigger names every week, it seems like, and it's fun to have that kind of special guest come in and just provide a new voice for our listeners.
That's amazing. How do you go about getting some of the people that you've interviewed?
Social media is huge for us. I mean, I think that's been where James has really found a lot of success. And I came from sports radio, so I still have some connections in the sports radio world. So just reaching out via text message. But social media has been awesome for getting a lot of these guests and to grow our community. So.
Kate, how has your experience, of course, you just said your work came from sports radio. How has that helped you in the podcast world?
I love hearing the sound of my own voice, obviously. So I co-host with James here, and then I also have my own podcast, which is a marketing podcast. I love, when I was a kid, I would sit in my room and have radio shows by myself. So that was my imagination time. I'd sit in my room and host radio shows. And I went to school to become a sports journalism major. And that's what I got a job doing right out of college. And it was my dream job. But the only problem was I needed to go to a smaller market, and I had a lot of difficulties finding openings. Things have really progressed since I graduated from school. And there are a lot more women announcing football, but at the time I wasn't a man, so I wasn't given as much consideration. Life took me down a different road, and I do more marketing stuff now. And I still have always had that passion though for sports, obviously football and hockey is my other big sport. But being able to do radio or a podcast is definitely where I've always had a strong passion. So this is kind of my passion project.
James, can you talk about, of course, how you came up with the logo idea?
So the logo idea was me playing around on an app, trying to find something that just kind of looked simple and easy, and it kind of explained exactly what the podcast was about without kind of too many words. We're actually rebranding, and we're rebranding. By the time this comes out, we'll have done it. So we are rebranding on Friday, and we're going to have all new logos, and to be fair, that's kind of down to Katie. Katie went out and got us a new logo for our football podcast, and it looked amazing. And I kind of decided, well, that style is really, really good and really strong. So I decided that we would just go with that style. Went back to the artist, and we have some brilliant logos coming out, and our website as well launches on Friday. So that is something that you'll see a lot more logos of us. So there's a lot of fun to be had on that website.
James, what are some of your future plans with the podcast?
So if you'd asked me this question a couple of months ago, I would have said I'll be done in 5 episodes because no one will listen. Since then, however, it's obviously grown. On both sides of the pond, 35% of our listenership is in the States, which is massive, I think, given that my name isn't Bill Simmons or Zach Lowe. So I think the fact that we're able to appeal is really good. So because of that, I've made some contacts through the podcast and through social media. Across the Pond Major League is one podcast that we've got coming next year. Another one is Across the Pond WNBA, which will be a dedicated WNBA podcast. I've already lined up a host or co-host, because I'm going to do it as well, because I've watched the WNBA over the last 2 years, and it's a really, really good sport to watch. I've always been a big NBA fan. That was always my first sport, but the WNBA has really impressed me over the last couple of years. And if I'm honest, their activism over the last kind of year or so as well is really strong. And I think that the WNBA needs more promotion. There's only 1 or 2 podcasts dedicated to the WNBA. So that's something that I really want to get into and promote the WNBA.
Kate, what are some of your future plans with the podcast?
I want James to do, I asked him to find me a host on his side of the pond for NHL, because I would love to talk NHL on the podcast with him when football season winds down. So I'd love, he's said himself, he's like, I'm not the biggest NHL fan, but I'd love to find a co-host on that side of the pond to talk NHL with.
That's wonderful. What are some of your future plans whenever it comes to branching out into different podcasts?
So I think really for the different podcasts, we kind of have 2 already in the mix, potentially a third for Katie and her NHL. So I think for us, they're going to be separate podcasts. I think we'll always keep Across the Pond Sports Podcast. And if I'm honest, I'm probably going to keep that as the NFL one that we have when it's in season. And then when NFL's not in season, it will just kind of revert back to a kind of general sports podcast. So we've got NHL potentially. We have Major League and WNBA. I think there has been I've heard some calls for a new fantasy basketball podcast and fantasy football podcasts. So that's another avenue for Katie to listen to herself more. But certainly in terms of fantasy basketball, there's really only one name in fantasy basketball, and that's Josh Lloyd and Locked On. So I know Ryan Doherty, who's going to be covering NBA with us. I know that's something he wants to get into.
When, of course, you plan on branching out, do you still plan on keeping the name Across the Pond and just adding like fantasy football and stuff?
Yeah, I think it's really important for the brand to still have that across the pond and still have a host from both sides. I think that's really strong, and I think it's playing really well on both sides. So certainly from the feedback that we've had, they really like that kind of contrast.
Hey, starting off with you, what is something that you didn't know before you started?
Oh man. I don't know. Like I haven't had the chance to really like dive in and talk sports since I was right out of college. And so this has been really fun to kind of just get back in and talked about sports with another person that's on that same level with me every week. So that's been really fun to do. It's just trying to kind of up my game. So I'm like, I got to make sure I read all the headlines and follow all the sports or all the teams and how they did that last weekend, because otherwise, I mean, I might not be typically tuning into any Bengals or Jets game this season. But since we have the podcast, I definitely need to at least read the headlines from the games and see what happens. And it's been fun to be able to really dive back into sports all the way since I joined the podcast.
James, what have you learned now that you didn't know before you started?
The podcasts aren't quite as easy as you might think to run. I'd never ever been in media at all. So for me, it was something that was totally alien. And I just started it, like I said before, I just kind of started on a whim because I thought I could do better than other people. So for me, it's been quite a steep learning curve, especially, I think we spoke about this earlier, off air, time differences. The time difference between Scotland and the US, it varies right across. So it's sometimes a bit of a struggle. We've had a couple of almost issues. When we had Katie's dad on, he's in California, so I gave him the wrong time by an hour. But thankfully he knew, and he corrected it for me. So when I called him up, and he was like, "I thought you were going to call now, not in an hour." So that worked. It was fine.
What advice would you give upcoming future sports talk podcasts looking to get started? Starting off with you, Kate.
I feel like this is more of a James question too, because this was his dream, and he just brought me along on the ride. And I mean, I think that it's one of those things where podcasting, if you want to do it, it's very easy to think like, oh, I'll just create a podcast. But then there's a lot of other like back end stuff if you want to really be successful with it. And I think that James has learned a lot just since starting it. I mean, like, we have the fantastic logo. He has the website. Like, we have a really strong presence on social media. So I think that all that stuff is important to have, and to understand, like, there's a lot that goes into a podcast, not just sitting down and hitting record. So I think that if that's something that you want to do, starting a podcast is great, but make sure that you have the time that is to be successful with it, if it's really something that you want to see take off.
James, what advice would you give upcoming future sports talk podcasts looking to get started?
I think for me, the biggest thing has been networking. Katie is obviously someone I found quite early on a kind of guesting Facebook page where you go to look for guests. And initially I was just looking for a guest maybe just to come on now and again. But when Katie came on, it was clear, obviously her knowledge of football was second to none. So it was a no-brainer to have her stay on. I would certainly say networking is a big one. That's how we've got our guests for the majority. I mean, we had Kelsey Trainer a couple of weeks ago, who is huge in New York in terms of her profession. She's a lawyer, and she was involved in the lawsuit with the US women's team against the US Federation, so a soccer federation. So we've managed to get people like that. And then we've had someone like yesterday, we had Ashley on, and she used to be the equipment manager at Notre Dame. And so like we're able to find guests just through networking. And that seems to have worked really, really well.
That's amazing. James, where can my listeners find Across the Pond on social media along with podcast platforms?
So by the time people listen to this, you'll be able to listen to the podcast actually on our website as well, atpsports.net. But we are everywhere in terms of podcasts, all your platforms, so Apple, Google, Spotify. In terms of social media, Across the Pond Sports Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, and also at ATP Sports Pod on Twitter.
Thank you again, Katie and James, for your interview, and best of luck at Across the Pond Sports Podcast.
Thanks so much for having us.
You can find Brandon Sports Talk on Facebook at Brandon Sports Talk, Instagram at Brandon Sports Talk, Twitter at Talk_Brandon, and you can find me on YouTube at Brandon Sports Talk. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you again, Katie and James, for your interview, and best of luck.
You've been watching Brandon Sports Talk. Please feel free to like, share, and subscribe to Brandon Sports Talk on social media and on YouTube.